And the other part as well is very fair-minded. I think Diane Francis is right. We want to do the right thing. We want to reduce pollution. We want to do our part. But why do we have to go further than anyone else? And why do we have to destroy our economy in the process? Is there a way to marry these two things? Well, we'll see if Keith Hirsche has the answer. Leading innovator in the oil and gas industry, originator of the RenuWell concept. This is a project to transform orphan oil wells with solar energy. We're going to find out what that's all about. Keith, thanks so much for being with me today. Have we got Keith on the line?
Yes, hi Danielle. I just cut out for a second there.
No problem. Now, I want to just be honest with you right off the hopper. I'm skeptical about solar and wind, increasingly so because of some of the work that Michael Schellenberger has done and Bjorn Lomborg has done and Patrick Moore has done in saying, why would we build a power grid on an intermittent power source that is only reliable 30% of the time and the sun goes down just when we need it most? So I'm just letting you know my starting point is you're going to have to convince me that this makes economic sense. So let's begin by you explaining what the project is all about.
Sure, Danielle, and obviously you have justification in your skepticism. I mean, my background is from the oil and gas industry. I spent 40 years in oil and gas. Started off in Alberta and had the chance also to work internationally for many years. We know oil and gas is a really important resource and is powering 80% of our society today. It's not going to go away tomorrow. We've also, as you pointed out, renewable energy sources are intermittent. And at the same time, what we don't take into account a lot of times is our energy usage is also intermittent. So we have some really great parallels, like in southern Alberta, where there's a very large electricity demand for irrigation. And that demand, the hotter and drier the year is, the more electricity demand there is for irrigation. And that's something that fluctuates seasonally, and it can be, change over the hours of the day. Our normal electricity use is high during the day when people are up and operating and goes down at night. So if you have an energy source that complements the load, like irrigation, for example, and solar, then you can actually have a very nice pairing in between an energy source which can deliver low-cost, efficient energy when it's needed for a specific purpose. And solar has many adaptations. I guess you really want to look what energy source you're using in which area. But solar, certainly in Alberta, is proving to be a very cost-effective energy source. And kind of what I've been working on is that one of the big problems with solar in Alberta is that in order to get the cost low, we have to have a very large project. The reason for that is that, it can take 5 years to get all of the permits and everything in place to put in a large-scale solar operation. And that can be the same amount of time and upfront investment, whether it's a 1 megawatt project or whether it's a 100 megawatt project. And but if for that 5 years of work you have to do to get the project off the ground, you can prorate that over higher output if you work on a bigger project. So this is what drives these very large solar projects around the world. Of course, if you have a big project, then you're running into land conflict because you're starting to use hundreds of acres of land that could be used for farming or wildlife habitat or things like that. So what I started working on, I guess, about 5-6 years ago is I was noticing that we had on the order of about 150,000 inactive wells around the province. Wells that were either abandoned or suspended or orphaned. And these wells are not producing oil and gas anymore. They're in southern Alberta. They're in our areas of the province that are depleted resource, and they're not going to be brought back. And now many oil companies and gas companies have gone broke over these past few years, and many of these sites are in the Orphan Well Association, where they're being funded partly by government funding, and the Surface Rights Board is having to pay landowners lease rentals.
Yeah.
Municipalities are also really suffering for not getting tax payments. So I started noticing that if we use some of the abandoned infrastructure, the lease pads, the roads, the power lines that are going into these lease sites, that we could actually build a model where we could put in a large number of small-scale solar projects at a cost that is very similar to the cost of the large-scale projects, but without using the same kind of agricultural land that we otherwise need to use.
So talk to us about the size of the pads so that we understand just how small scale you're talking about, and then we'll talk about how you're going to weave them together. So are these 1 acre sites or what are they?
Yeah, Danielle, they're basically 2 acre sites is our standard lease in Alberta. So most of our farms, and in fact, my family has a farm south of Taber. We have an oil field on that farm, which my dad also operated, so it's kind of very close to my heart. But most of the leases are about 2 acres. They might be as large as 4 acres in some cases. So we're effectively designed solar arrays that are going to be going on these sites, basically fill the 2 to 4 acre site. And we're targeting areas that have low quality agricultural land, things like the pivot corners on irrigated fields. As you know, the pivot systems irrigate a circular section of the field and leave the corners unirrigated. And often the AER was stipulating that the oil companies drill from the corners because that way they didn't interrupt the farming operation and they could directionally drill. So we're basically targeting the lower quality agricultural land and kind of 2 to 4 acre sites is our primary target.
How many megawatts can a 2 to 4 acre site generate?
Yeah, this is a great thing. When I started this project 6 years ago, the answer was 300 kilowatts for 2 acres. But because of the advances in solar technology, we can almost get about 750 kilowatts on the same land area. And by next year, we'll be getting a megawatt on that same
So
area.
if you get it up to a megawatt, then how much power does that generate? Like, can you put it into how many hours of irrigation, or put it into how many homes that could be powered? Like, what is a measure of a megawatt so people can understand how significant that might be?
Yeah, sure thing. When we're looking at, say, a 750 megawatt site, you can power about 60 pivot irrigation systems, quarter section systems that are using 30 kilowatt or 40 horsepower pumps. So, you're basically talking, say, roughly 50 fields at 160 acres of field. So, you're putting a lot of water on the ground for 1 megawatt of power.
How just so I understand, how many farms would that be? Because some of these operations have to be quite large in order to operate. So is that multiple families that you'd be able to have 50 fields on, or is that just one large operation? Just give me some idea of how many people might benefit from this, how many farmers might benefit.
Yeah, it's really an issue of scale, Danielle, as you said. Certainly one of these systems would power a very large Hutterite colony, for example. A lot of the farmers are up around, say, 4,000 or 5,000 acres in southern Alberta, and you would be able to power an entire farm off one site.
Wow. Okay. So the other part then, is this going to be, the term they have for it in the oil sands is, I think, behind the fence type of generation. So it doesn't go into the power grid. Is that the notion here? Is that these would be specific sites for this specific purpose, or would it go generally into the power grid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when we started this process, I actually was looking at it as a way of saving money for the oil and gas companies because, you could do a behind-the-fence operation on an existing oil field. One of the big costs in southern Alberta on mature fields is the pumping costs, a certain water injection or solvent injection, and the production pumps. But basically, in the initial stages of this, the oil companies weren't taking it up. There was, I think, reasons around, liability issues and things like that for lease liabilities that were unsettled at the time. But now we're getting a really good uptake, and effectively the behind-the-fence kind of model, as you're pointing to, is if you were going to use the power for your own operation, it has certain advantages, and it can be done in Alberta under the microgeneration. And that's very cost effective. And that's certainly one application we can use this for. But the actual project we received funding for from the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre, they're funded by Alberta Rural and Urban Municipality Associations. They've given us funding for this pilot as part of the small scale and community generation initiative that the province started a little over a year ago. And kind of the goal there is to be able to create generation projects, electricity generation projects that are at a scale that community members or co-ops or groups of farms together can invest in. And that is designed to put power on the grid. And that has advantages because one of our biggest, as you probably know in Alberta, we have very low cost electricity in terms of energy. We average about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But if you look at the actual power bill, and this is especially true for irrigators, by the time you add the distribution tariff and the transmission tariff, they're paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour. We have the second highest power rates of all provinces in Canada if you include transmission and distribution. We're more expensive than Ontario. And by putting these sites in the distribution network, where we can avoid building out more transmission capacity, we can actually hopefully reduce this delivery cost that everybody's paying on the power bill. So kind of the goal is to be able to put these in the distribution network so we can offset the amount of large transmission projects that are being added onto our electricity bills for everybody.
But you're still going to have to increase distribution charges if you're doing that thing, because you're going to have to connect everything into the grid in the first place. And right now, my understanding would be that there wouldn't be distribution lines going out to each of these sites, or would there be?
Yes, this is one of our advantages, is that we're basically targeting sites that already had electrical service going in. So people, like there's an awful lot of sites in southern Alberta where there's three-phase power going into the production pumps that were producing the oil. And so that's one of our primary targets. This idea won't work everywhere. I mean, it's really targeting about 10% of the sites in the province. But in those sites, we've got three-phase power. We're looking for the sites that have what I would call soft spots in the grid. In other words, there's more load in those areas than there is transmission capacity or just available generation capacity. So we can, because there's so many leases in southern Alberta, we can really pick and choose where to put this, and we can strategically locate projects where they have the best fit to the local load. And
okay,
this can then help us really offset the transmission distribution charges.
Well, let me pause you. Keith Hirsche is my guest, leading innovator in the oil and gas industry, originator of this RenuWell concept. So as you can see, how they're designing it is to try to match the surge in energy with the production of it in an area where it makes sense, particularly in irrigation. Now, the question will be for me, what happens to the liability of all of those suspended or inactive wells? It doesn't just disappear just because you've got a new use. You still have to reclaim it, don't you? We're going to find out when we return. Stay with us on 770 CHQR. All right, guys, as you know, I have a healthy skepticism about how much solar is going to save us. And I worry, actually, about adding too much to the grid, because just watch what's happening in California. California independent system operators bracing for rolling outages through Wednesday after a record-breaking heat wave in the western U.S. strained energy supplies and necessitated power shutoffs that affected hundreds of thousands of customers over the weekend. Situation's a perfect storm of events with insufficient procurement of resources to deal with these situations, changing system needs, in part due to increasing amounts of solar and other flexible sources on the system, and a reduction on imports. It goes on to say we have to have a realistic view of how much wind, solar, and others can be integrated into the grid. And they're starting a process of asking for 3,300 megawatts of new power procurement to come online, mostly natural gas, because of the need for having a source that you can rely on. So that's where my concern about solar comes in. This, however, does sound like it's a smaller scale project designed for a specific purpose using existing sites. And so it may be one of those ones that pass the cost benefit test. Let me continue our conversation with Keith Hirsche. He's a leading innovator in the oil and gas industry, originator of the RenuWell concept. And I've got a lot of people asking the question, 150,000 inactive wells. There's a lot of work that goes through reclaiming them, a lot of liability associated with that. So what happens there? Before you convert to solar, do you have to do that reclamation? Or do you assume the reclamation liability so that at some point, if we no longer have solar on the site, then you're responsible for both the surface and the subsurface? Can you sort of fill in the gaps for us on that?
Danielle, it's an excellent question. And that was really, when I started this project 5 years ago, I did not appreciate the depth of that question. And I'm grateful for the guidance and the support that the AR provided through, this entire time frame, because one of the big concerns was, as has been reported in some media, there were some really unfortunate things happening in the province where companies were actually being set up like as kind of shell companies, where a company would buy assets, mature assets from a larger company. They would filter out the productive wells, set up another company, and they would dump off the unproductive wells into that second company, bankrupt that company, and then put it on the Orphan Well Association. So there's been a lot of liability issues that were causing major issues in the province, as you're aware. And this was all going through the Supreme Court with the Redwater decision. I became pretty aware of this both because of our own farm and also because Daryl Bennett, who's one of Canada's leading landowner advocates, is from my hometown. So the oil and gas liability issue is a major one. And as you know, there's a $1.2 billion federal dollars right now been given to the province to help address this. We need to work on this. And kind of where we're coming from here and what we worked out with the AER is that the first thing that has to happen is the wells have to be properly abandoned. That means that the downhole has to be sealed, groundwater has to be protected, the well has to be cut and capped below surface. Then all of the surface equipment has to be taken out. And then the next step is the land has to be tested for contamination. And any contamination that's there has to be removed. And this is all either the oil company's liability, as has always been the case, the polluter pay principle, or it is, if the company's bankrupt, that's something the RenuWell Association has to take care of. But where we really come in is the next step. After all of the contamination is gone and everything, the land has to be restored to what's called its equivalent capacity. And so that means that it has to be able to produce either crops at an equivalent rate to the surrounding land, or has to be the equivalent grassland or whatever's nearby, or forest, for example. And that period of basically putting in new vegetation, taking time for the soil to restore, to bring everything back to its original state, that can take 3 to 5 years, where the oil company still has to pay lease rental through that time period, still has to pay some partial municipal tax, but the land is just in a state of being monitored through that time period. Yeah. And the other thing that has to happen is if there's any roads that have been put into that lease or any power lines put into that lease, that equipment has to be taken out. What we really are able to do in terms of saving money for the oil and gas industry is we're able to take the sites at the stage where it's being revegetated. We can work with the landowner to make sure that the vegetation that's being put in is something that will complement the soil, will build the soil over time. But we can leave the roads and power lines in place and reuse them. And then when the solar project is finished, maybe 50 years down the road, then that road and power line can be taken out by the solar operator at that time.
Okay, and so who then, you as the solar company then at some point would then pay for the surface access in the same way that the oil companies did?
Yeah, basically within our model, we would take over the lease payments that the oil company has been paying. So we would have it would be under this new directive. One way of doing this, the most common way, is it would be called an overlapping surface lease. So we would take out a new lease with the landowner for that same land area, and then basically we would take the responsibility from the point that we take on the land going forward.
Okay, last question comes from actually a council member in Foothills County saying, interested in what your recycling plan is in Canada and Alberta, because we have no program. Right. She put forth a resolution at the Rural Municipalities Association that's gone nowhere. And I kind of get this fear that it's, okay, let's put these solar panels in place and we'll figure out the recycling plans sometime down the road. Do you have a plan?
Yes. And again, this is a very good question. In the past, one of the last phases we did in this project was after we got everything through at the provincial level with AEP, Alberta Environment, and Alberta Energy Regulator, we went to get a permit for our first site, and it was with the municipal district of Taber. And one of their councillors had exactly that question, basically said, look, no one would have thought we'd end up with this mess with oil and gas liabilities. What are you going to do down the road with solar? And so we've actually been partnering with a group, or in very close communication with a group that's an energy company in Taber called Determination Drilling. They are a solar company, but they also have a subsidiary where they're one of the pioneers in solar recycling and solar decommissioning. And so we've been working with them, and they've given us a roadmap that we've included in the work that we did for the municipalities as part of our previous project. So we actually have a roadmap for recycling these projects. And yeah, it's a very valid question. I'd be happy to share more details.
Well, Keith, thank you for that. Maybe we'll follow up, because I wouldn't mind chatting with that group, because that always seemed to be a big missing piece in the solar puzzle. And so I appreciate your time and telling us about it today. We'll look forward to seeing how it progresses. That's Keith Hirsche, who's leading innovator in the oil and gas industry, originator of the RenuWell concept. Seems like they've thought of everything. But if you guys think that there's a problem, I know you'll tell me. Stay with us. When we get back, we'll talk to Tony Heller, scientist, engineer, wildlife photographer, lifelong environmentalist, and YouTube sensation. To stay with us, news is next on 770 CHQR.